Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege to preside this session on benefits and cost of unification with such distinguished speakers and panelists. Before I begin, Hyun Oh-seok, president of KDI, asked me to convey his deep regret for not being able to be here because of his duty to appear in the National Congress Committee hearing. Although we start about 15 minutes late, we need to finish at 12:30 because of next schedule, so I'll refrain from making my own statement, and also I'd like to ask cooperation from speakers and panelists to keep within time limit. Now I'd like to briefly introduce presenters. First presenter is Mr. Marcus Noland. Marcus Noland is the Deputy Director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a Senior Fellow at the East-West Center. Mr. Noland has authored, co-authored or edited numerous books and articles, and among his book, Avoiding the Apocalypse, The Future of the Two Koreas, won the prestigious Oira Memorial Prize. Second speaker is Mr. Il-Tung Go. Il-Tung Go is a senior fellow and the managing director of the Economic Information and Education Center at the Korea Development Institute. Each speaker is allowed for 15 minutes for presentation. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Noland to make a presentation. Please welcome Mr. Noland with warm applause.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here this morning. I come to you with a bit of trepidation. I am an American who is being asked to speak about Korean unification and its relationship to the German case in front of an audience made up largely of Koreans and Germans. So I recognize the difficulty of my task ahead. I will try to be quick given our schedule. There's essentially two scenarios for, broadly speaking, there are two scenarios for unification. A gradual or consensual process, which is what the two governments support, and then an abrupt process that would be more like the German case. With respect to the latter scenario, there are some potential differences, and I just want to emphasize a couple things. First of all, the establishment of civil order is critical. Just see what happened to the United States and Iraq. If you don't get the establishment of civil order, you're not going to get any kind of real economic development. Secondly, the clarification of property rights, the rapid clarification of property rights is essential. Because without clarification of property rights, you will not get investment. And as former Deputy Minister Carstens observed this morning, without investment, you don't get growth, and you don't get the change in the composition of output and the spatial reallocation of activity that is going to be very important in the case of North Korea. The good news is, if you do have a kind of unification on the German model, it's good for the peninsula. Indeed, in either scenario, it's good in the sense that peninsular growth rate accelerates, there's a dramatic reduction in poverty. The bad news is it could cost $1 trillion over 10 years, which is equivalent of about 100% of annual GDP of South Korea. Okay, so quickly, gradual integration. It's important to remember that we support the notion of engagement as an instrument, not as an end in itself. We want to engage North Korea in order to encourage the evolution of North Korea in a way that would be more humane internally and less belligerent externally. And in the interest of time, I will not address this in any detail, though we can in the question and answer. But how you go about engaging is absolutely critical. The effectiveness of engagement is highly contingent on North Korean policy. And I think we should speak frankly, as Michael Funke was saying earlier. And the fact of the matter is today, North Korea has an absolutely terrible business enabling environment. It's tied for worst in the Transparency International poll on corruption. South Korea's engagement with North Korea is largely underpinned by South Korean direct and indirect public subsidies. If you remove those, North-South engagement would collapse. And I think we need to be frank about this. From the standpoint of South Korea, if you had significant engagement with the North, product market effects would be relatively minor because North Korean economy is so small relative to South Korea. Factor market effects are potentially large, and I'll come back to this later. And the political economy effects are potentially quite important with South Korea's own internal economy and business government relations. Now, let's talk about the case of abrupt integration. First of all, let's assume away mass violence. And I want to underline this point. If I were a South Korean, I would go to bed every night praying for an East German-style collapse of the North. East German unification has a very bad reputation here in South Korea because it's seen as a costly failure. But please remember, there was no mass violence. Nobody got hurt. And in the end, East Germany was liberated from a truly odious system. Yes, it's cost money, but that's just money. No lives were lost. If you think about the extraordinarily militarized case of North Korea, armed with nuclear weapons, an equivalent collapse in there could be a very different show. And one, frankly, that economists in this audience can't even address. So my modeling is going to assume all that away. Assume a gentle East German-style collapse. It is likely when we pull the rock up, things are going to be a lot worse underneath than we expect. Human capital is probably much worse than we expect. The educational system in North Korea for non-elites has effectively collapsed. Environmental degradation is vast and will be costly to clean up. Good news, North Korea's number one asset, South Korea. I mean, South Korea is the best thing North Korea has going for it. It has a younger population than South Korea, as a number of the presenters will present. The experience at KIC suggests a reasonably disciplined labor force, and we know that they have pockets of excellence. In particular, they can produce multi-stage rockets and other such equipment. Now, the German experience. I will go very quickly since we have a room full of Germans. Germany is interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, one is the political goals in the West German case, like what are likely to be the political goals in the South Korean case, are defensible but probably internally contradictory. West Germany wanted to stem the flow of migrants, which Michael Funke thinks was a bad thing. It wanted to protect West German wages, which is eminently understandable. And it wanted to achieve restitution of property. In addition, East Germany faced the standard challenges of transition, macroeconomic stabilization, liberalization of trade and prices, privatization, creation of a social safety net, and the creation of a legal framework for commercial transactions. Two key points here. Privatization, again, is a means to an end, not an end in itself. The reason you want privatization is you want investment. You want somebody owning assets, so they will invest, so the economy will start going. In the case of East Germany, the policy of restitution greatly slowed that process. So in the case of North Korea, we should have compensation for former owners of assets in North Korea, but not restitution. That'll just gum up the whole process. Secondly, in the case of the monetary union, there's always enormous focus on the exchange rate of monetary conversion. And that's an interesting topic, but it's not the critical one. The critical one is, for institutional reasons, nobody represented the future owners of East German capital assets. As a consequence, there was an extraordinary increase of wages in East Germany. It's the wage increase after unification that killed output in East Germany, not the initial conversion rate. And let's be clear, it was quite a bad outcome. GDP fell by 30%, industrial production fell by 2/3, unemployment went to 30%. Indeed, it was worse than the Great Depression. So how does Germany and South Korea line up? Well, you're going to hear multiple times today, North Korea is larger and poorer than East Germany was in comparison to West Germany. North Korea's economy is undoubtedly more distorted than East Germany's was. South Korea is not as rich as West Germany was in 1989, and North Koreans are much more isolated than East Germans were. Fundamental reform in North Korea would involve a great opening of this relatively small economy to the world, big increased exposure of international trade and investment, and literally millions of North Koreans shifting jobs as they got reallocated to more efficient activities. Product market integration, as I said, would have little impact on the South, but factor market integration could be very big. And as Michael Funke implied in his earlier remarks, if you simply took away the border, given the vast differences in income, you would depopulate North Korea. So there's a real issue about whether you maintain the DMZ as a method of population influx control in some transitional period. So when you calculate costs and benefits, there are basically 5 parameters that are really important. The first one is how fast can North Korea absorb new technology? How fast does total factor productivity rise? Secondly, how much labor migrates from the north to the south? Third, how much capital goes into the north, and how much comes from the south and how much comes from the rest of the world? That affects the real exchange rate and will have implications for the composition of output in South Korea. Fourthly, is that capital invested on concessional terms or profit-seeking terms? Because that means where is the flow of profits going, which will affect GDP and GNP. So those are the key issues. And I will present some illustrative modeling results that were taken from some papers that Sherman Robinson and I wrote more than a decade ago that appeared in the book that Dr. Chung mentioned in the introduction. These models are calibrated in 1996, and I'll try to update that in the back of the envelope way in a moment. So basically, how much money is required to bring North Korea up to 60% of the level of South Korea is, of course, a function, I don't know, will this give, yes, a function of how fast North Korea can absorb new technology. If it absorbs new technology rapidly, then the bill may not be quite as high. Under plausible parameterizations, the total cost would be on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars over a 10-year period. Second thing, as I mentioned, a critical issue is how much of that capital comes from South Korea and how much of it comes from outside of South Korea. If it comes from outside of South Korea, and of course this is modeling, so we can take extreme cases. If 100% came from outside of South Korea, you'd have a very rapid and extreme appreciation of the real exchange rate. That would in turn would have effects on the composition of output. If you have that big real exchange rate effect, traded goods production in South Korea really gets pushed down. On the other hand, there's an explosion of non-traded goods. So that's another thing to be taken into account. But the key issue, which comes out of my modeling work, also comes out of the work that Michael Funke and one of his colleagues, Holger Strulich, did, was that overall the process would lead to an acceleration of peninsula-wide growth. Mainly driven by an extraordinary acceleration of North Korean growth. South Korea would slow, but not go negative, and overall the peninsula would benefit. There would be a tremendous reduction in poverty on the peninsula. So what are the factor market effects? Under plausible parameterization, wages and incomes eventually converge, and the rate of capital return equalizes over the course of a decade. So basically, North Koreans get richer faster than South Koreans do, so there's convergence in incomes, and eventually with capital deepening, the rate of return on capital in the North falls to the level of capital return in the South. That will have an impact on income distribution here in South Korea. And again, I really enjoyed Michael's comments earlier. We should speak frankly about this. If this process goes through, then there's a shift in the distribution of income here in South Korea from labor towards capital. And there's a shift of the distribution within labor from relatively low-skilled workers to relatively high-skilled workers. If you assume that relatively high-skilled workers are predominant owners of capital, that suggests that there would be both an increase in income and wealth inequality here in South Korea without some compensatory government policies. Now, of course, you can have compensatory policies and blunt this, but again, it's something that one needs to think about. As I mentioned, these models were calibrated for 1996, and we have never gone back and tried to update them in any real way. But they're roughly log linear, so if you simply look at the divergence of income between North and South Korea over that intervening period, in which South Korea per capita income is rising at roughly 3% a year, and North Korean per capita income is roughly flatlining, the gap has grown wider and wider. So that kind of base case that I had of 1996, where the costs were, say, $600 billion over a decade, now is well over $1 trillion, or roughly 100% of annual output in South Korea. So, what should be done? First of all, we want to have engagement because we want to transform North Korea to establish a reasonable basis for national reconciliation and ultimately unification. We cannot unify the Koreas under the current economic and political institutions of North Korea, or at least we wouldn't want to. So we want to engage, and we want engagement to be calibrated in the way that will fundamentally try to push North Korea along in a positive direction. While we're doing that, South Korea ought to run a tighter fiscal policy than might otherwise be recommended, because you're going to need to put away money for this potentially very costly rainy day. I'm not a South Korean and I'm not a politician, so I don't think it's for me to comment on the particular tactics involved in this, but I think that President Lee Myung-bak ought to be applauded for at least putting this issue on the agenda. His successors may find different formulas for doing this, but it's a real issue for South Korea. Thirdly, South Korea needs to strengthen the Fair Trade Commission and its own campaign finance laws. One of the things that happened in East Germany was West German firms took over their East German counterparts and simply shut them down or turned them into sales offices. That was one of the things that led to such a dramatic fall in industrial output in East Germany. Obviously, the agent for doing all the rehabilitation that is going to be necessary in North Korea is the chaebol. But we want the chaebol to act in ways that are publicly responsible, and that means strengthening the regulatory framework here in South Korea before the fact, with both respect to anti-competitive behavior as well as political campaign finance. With respect to monetary union, I'm sure that this is practically a reunion of KDI, since I was once a visiting scholar there. I'm sure my South Korean colleagues are doing the best they can to figure out what the relative real exchange rates are. But it's not enough to focus on exchange rate conversion at the time of monetary union. There has to be a focus on subsequent wage setting, which is what really brought the East German case apart. And finally, just to reiterate, one has to clarify property rights quickly in order to get investment. Without investment, there will be no upswing in the North Korean economy. That means compensation, but not restitution. It means that owners who actually own those assets will resist unwarranted wage increases. We want to give land to the tiller and farmers. We want to get housing to residents to try to dampen this impulse for everyone to move south. And then finally, in terms of privatization, one wants to try to come up with formulas that would not simply mean that North Korean assets are transferred to South Koreans or others at fire sale prices. I thank you very much for your attention. I stayed almost within the time limit. And if you are interested in these issues, please take a look at the blog that I run with daily posts, North Korea Witness to Transformation, at that address. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan, for brief but full of insightful points. Next speaker is Mr. Ilton Go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Dr. Nolan mentioned a moment ago, about 15 minutes is given to me, and which means that I might have to finish my presentation with only 15 sentences. And the other one that I have to take care of is the fact that every time when I meet Dr. Nolan at this type of unification related conference, I just try to make one thing straighten. That about the couple of decades ago, where immediately after the German unification, Dr. Nolan had stayed at the KDI, and we talked about unification issues. Of course, I think at that time, most of the unification problem raised in Germany has been covered in newspapers and also mass media. So naturally, I think all those problems or the dark side might have been the issue for our conversation, but we still, I can recollect that we just try to take a look at the German situation with admiration and envy. I think that's our own mind. Yeah, and the issue that I'm going to talk about is on benefit and cost of unification, and as a matter of fact, much of my presentation would be just overlapped with Dr. Nolan, so I think that there might need some adjustment and some division of labor between us. Okay. I'm here. 어때 이걸 하면 돼? Okay. Yeah, there are 6 chapters in my presentation, but as a matter of fact, we can just, express them into 3 issues. One is how the unification cost. The issue might have been involved in Korea for the past 2 decades, and the other one is just trying to make a comparison between Germany and Korea in an effort to make some interesting or informative lessons from the German experiences. And also, I think I'm going to touch several issues on the integration the aspects. Ever since the German unification took place on the other side of this planet, probably I think cost of unification that always accompanied with all those talks on unification issues, and probably that might be the real dark side that the Korean people might have to handle when the same scenario or the same drama would take place on this part of the world. Sorry. And in the first, okay, let's skip this part. And when it comes to the unification cost, simple arithmetic, the outcome would be, okay, as this was already mentioned in the previous session again and again. And if you just take a look at the population ratio, 4 West German people can support just one East German brother. On the other hand, 2 South Koreans have to support 1 North Korean people. And on the other hand, I think the cost of unification would be proportional to the divergence or disparity of income between the 2 divided regions, which means that South Korea has to pay much higher burden than the West German have been doing so far. I think this is pretty natural outcome if you just take a look at the situation of the 2 countries. And afterwards, okay, this is in Korean and a pretty interesting article that's been covered in Mail Economic Daily. What happened was this. After the unification cost has become a real serious issue in Germany, Koreans also tried to figure out what would happen or what might be the real burden for the Korean people. And as a matter of fact, you can see over here, Dr. Hwang is just sitting behind in the second row of the center column, and then some other the scholars over here. And those are the scholars who made a contribution for the estimation of unification cost for the Korean Peninsula, and here this is Korea Development Institute, which does not have a human face. I mean, in other words, it's just, I mean, the organization, so he could not put the picture over here. But as you can see, what they did was whole different definitions applied in the estimation of or arithmetic, I mean, calculation of the unification. Sorry. Unification cost, and what happened was a whole different result was naturally come out, and okay. The problem was this. One was that so varied the estimation result, and then there was some indication that there was some criticism that this would raise very serious social confusion among the people, and the other one is too high burden of unification cost. That is going to be real detrimental to unification movement. And just with regard to those, the criticism, some scholars just try to come up with some ways to take care of those problems. And then, okay, too high burden, okay. Here, I mean, so high burden of unification would be quite detrimental to the movement for unification. So why don't we show that there is some bright side? Okay, cost would be accompanied with some benefit of unification. And the problem with me is that consequently, all of a sudden, the issue of unification shifted from contingency planning. This was the original objective of calculating or estimating the cost, but all of a sudden the issue has shifted to cost-benefit analysis, as if it's under your own choice. And that was the situation, and further past several or almost, I mean, the 10 years or so, people just try to demonstrate, okay, take a look at the result. Here, the benefit side would be much greater than the cost. So the unification is really desirable. And that was kind of the result that such type of approach just tried to demonstrate. But here, I would say that I'm just wondering if that's really desirable or really, I mean, the worthwhile effort to show that. But in doing that, we dissipated, or we just consumed lots of time and effort on something unnecessary, works. That's one of the problems associated with the unification cost discussed over here in Korea for the past several or around 10 years or so. And I skip this part, and okay, here probably I think we can just skip this part too. Different constraint. I think this has been pretty much talked about in the first session of this conference. I mean, in conclusion, simply comparing the Germany and Korea, we can say that in German case, simply extension of West Germany's existing system was feasible thanks to high level of national homogeneity. In other words, I think Germany might have been successful in on improving or raising the homogeneity between those two regions. I mean, between East and West Germany. But on the other hand, here in Korea, there was pretty high level of heterogeneity between North and South Korea, which means that the direct application of South Korea's system would not be quite feasible for North Korean society. This means that full integration in social institution would take much longer time and especially, market activities and various other social services would be pretty hard or difficult to transplant in the North Korean region if the unification is going to take place in one way or another. And I'm going to, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to mention several issues in relation with the unification, and one thing is migration. And this part has been, this issue has been mentioned in the first session by Dr. Sungye and then also by Dr. Mark Nolan. The point that I would like to make in relation with the migration is that if you just take a look at the picture, the map of the Korean Peninsula, DMZ, the demilitarized zone is actually not the demilitarized area. It's probably one of the most heavily militarized area in the world. So if there's some humanitarian disaster is going to take place in North Korea, probably I think it's not that easy for the North Korean people to cross the demilitarized zone. One thing is that up there in northern part of demilitarized zone, the population is real sparsely. The people are pretty sparsely populated, and the problem, as I mentioned earlier, the humanitarian disaster is going to take place. They would head toward China instead of southward movement. And here, the interesting point is that under such a situation, so-called this voting with feet is less likely to become the prime locomotive of unification in Korea. So then, what is going to be the real locomotive of unification in Korea? Please don't ask me about that. I think that is going to be a totally different scenario if you are going to plug in that condition over here in this situation. And the other point that I'd like to mention is that I think this has been mentioned in the previous session and also the presenter. Here, the point is that the young age group, I think they would try to move first, and then also female and young population, then again middle-aged group, and then it's quite doubtful whether the old-age group may try to move southward or not. Quite recently, we observed that those people who has been just escaped from North Korea, North Korean defectors, they try to introduce or invite secretly their separated family up there in northern part of Korea. But those old generation, they opted to stay there, and instead of crossing the border, or instead of moving toward the China and then coming down to South Korea, they rather stay there, and then what they want is kind of financial support from their children down here in South Korea. If you just, take that into account, probably the same situation will take place if unification is going to happen in the future. The other point is the marriage pattern. Here in Korea, about 10% of total marriages accounted for by the multicultural family. In other words, I mean, the international marriage is quite prevalent in Korea. Chinese and Vietnamese account for about 36.6%, and then the third one is Philippines. And here we can raise question whether, if unification is to take place, the South Korean try to get marriage with the North Korean people. Probably not. That's my hunch. And then some the demographic specialists also supported that view. And then I think this is the situation in Germany where the marriage barrier between East and West is much higher than the international marriage over there. Okay, monetary union. A moment ago, Dr. Nolan just, shifted the burden to me, but I think this is a very complicated issue. But one point that I would like to make is that much different from Germany. Probably, I think we cannot strictly apply so-called conversion rate with respect to the financial flow, such as wage or the pension or like that. Because it's very difficult for us to acknowledge the North Korea's existing wage or pension level. Probably, I think we have to set those initial value administratively or politically. That's one of the message that we can deliver in relation with the monetary union. Okay, I'll skip this one and financial integration account. Also, coming back to the financial accounting for industries. It's highly probable that the high level of write-off of financial asset would be inevitable, and also, existing financial statements in North Korea can hardly be any reference. So new balance sheet has to be made out based on market values, which is that simple application of conversion rate based on the existing all those financial statements, which was the how the German tried to make out the initial financial statement with the effort of Treuhandanstalt. Turned out to be not quite feasible for the Korean people. And then also, privatization. A number of people already, indicate the fact that restitution would not be quite desirable. But here, in addition to that, I'd like to add that restitution would not be quite feasible or technically operational, technically unapplicable in North Korea, because we learned that all the here no land register or terrier in all the lot number. If you're going to get back your old land, what you need is this document, but it's all missing in North Korea. Probably you might have to check that out in the archive of the Japan. Yeah. Okay. I think the remaining part is pretty similar, and here, coming to the conclusion, finally, all I can say is that all those measures are kind of the policies at the initial or interim period. What we really need is, I would say that the basic question that we have to come up with is the fact that how to take care of the discrepancy or the differences between the wage level and the productivity. I think this is going to be a real big issue in relation with labor market as well as regional disparity. And in that aspect, I would like to raise a question to those German scholars and the German high-ranking government officials for some lessons or some the guidance for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goh. We're going to hear from two panelists. I'd like to ask cooperation of participants to use not more than 5 minutes. First panelist is Mr. Seok Lee, who is the director of North Korean Economic Research Team at the Korea Development Institute.
Good afternoon. My name is Seok Lee, and I studied the North Korean economy at KDI. I'm very happy to join this important seminar and discuss those wonderful presentations by Dr. Noland and Dr. Go-il-dong. Indeed, I have learned a lot from those presentations, and I have agreed with all the points they made. So I will not make any critical comments on the presentation. Instead, I would like to ask some general questions about unification cost and benefits. Because I've studied the North Korean economy, I have been frequently asked to calculate the unification cost and benefits. But indeed, I have done such a calculation several times. But whenever I do such a calculation, I have always faced some basic problems, some basic questions about unification cost and benefits. So I would like to ask those questions for this seminar. And please excuse me to speak in Korean from now on, because it will help us to save lots of time. And we have got wonderful interpreters here, so I'm pretty sure that you will be able to very clearly understand what I'm saying in Korean. Okay? Then let me start. 시작하겠습니다. 첫 번째 제 질문은 이런 겁니다. 과연 우리가 통일 비용, 통일 편익이라고 하는 것에 대해 이해하고 하고 있는데 정확하게 비용이 뭐고 편익이 뭔가를 우리가 알 수 있는가라고 하는 점입니다. 제가요 간단하게 이해를 두 가지만 들어서 설명을 하겠습니다. 많은 분들은요 통일이 되면 한국의 국방비 지출이 줄어들 것이라고 예상을 하십니다. 당연한 일이겠죠. 그리고 만약에 한국의 국방비 지출이 줄어든다면 이것은 통일의 중요한 편익이 될 것입니다. 그런데 이렇게 생각하지 않는 분들도 있습니다. 어떤 분들은요 한국이 만약에 통일이 된다면 이제 더 이상 우리는 매우 못 살고 힘이 약한 북한과 국경을 접다는 것이 아니라 세계 G2인 중국, 세계의 가장 강력한 군사를 가지고 있는 러시아 등과도 국경을 맞대는 상황으로 변한다라는 것입니다. 그래서 과연 국방비가 줄어들겠는가? 아니다. 어떻게 되면 국방비가 늘어날 수도 있다라고 주장을 하십니다. 그렇다면 과연 어느 게 맞을까요? 국방비라고 하는 것은 통일이 됐을 때 국방비의 변동은 우리에게 비용입니까? 편익입니까? 잘 모르죠. 두 번째로 요즘 한국 사회에서는요 저출산과 고령화 문제 때문에 상당히 고민을 많이 합니다. 향후에 한국의 인구가 줄어들고 이에 따라서 노동력도 줄어들고요. 그래서 한국의 경제가 상당히 침체할 것이다라고 우려합니다. 그리고 통일이 되면 이런 한국 사회가 직면하고 있는 인구학적인 문제들이 상당히 해소될 수 있다라고 얘기합니다. 왜냐하면 북한의 인구가 적있기 때문에. 그렇지만요, 이거 한번 보면 어떨까요? 이것은요, 2008년 북한의 인구 센서스 데이터를 가지고 향후 북한의 인구를 추정한 것입니다. 이 추정에 따르면요, 북한의 인구 경향은 데모그래픽 트렌드는 한국하고 크게 다르지 않습니다. 물론 약간은 한국보다는 좀 좋은데요. 그럼에도 불구하고 2030년대 후반을 기점으로 해서 북한도 인구가 줄어드는 것으로 지금 예상되고 있습니다. 더더욱 문제가 되는 것은 무엇이냐면요. 북한의 경우에는 좀 특이한 세대가 있습니다. 대표적으로 무엇이냐? 식량난 세대가 그렇습니다. 지난 15년 동안 북한에는 상당한 정도의 식량난을 경험했고요. 이런 식량난이 북한의 어린 세대, 영유아 세대에 굉장히 영향을 미쳤다고 이야기합니다. 과연 이런 세대가 정상적인 어떤 노동세대로 전할 수 있을지 아무도 모릅니다. 더구나 지금 당장에 통일된다면 아마 독일에서도 그러겠지만 약 50세 이상의 북한 사람들은 노동시장에서 생활하기 힘들 겁니다. 과연 이런 상황에서 통일이 되어서 인구학적인 축복이 되겠느냐? 이런 의문이 있어요. 또 더더욱 재밌는 건 이런 겁니다. 이거 독일의 경험인데요. 통일 이후에 동독의 케이스를 보면요. 인구학적으로 굉장히 충격을 받습니다. 동독 지역이 어떻게 충격받느냐? 결혼 건수가 급격히 감소합니다. 그리고 출생자도 급격히 감소합니다. 이거는 당연하겠죠. 통일이라고 하는 스트레스를 가져가지고 이런 인구학적 충격이 독일에 나타나는 것입니다. 즉 출생률이 감소하고 사람들이 결혼하지 않는 이런 부정적인 충격입니다. 만약에 이런 현상이 남북한 통일에서 나타난다라고 하면 과연 남북한 통일이 한국의 인구 문제를 해결하는 수단이 될 수 있느냐? 자, 그렇다면 과연 남북한 통일이라고 하는 것이 남북한 인구 문제라는 측면에서 이게 비용이냐 편익이냐 잘 모른다라는 것입니다. 이것처럼요. 우리가 통일 편익 또는 비용을 얘기하지만 조금만 더 들어가 보면 무엇이 과연 비용이고 무엇이 편익인가에 대한 논쟁이 상당히 많을 수 있습니다. 그래서 과연 이걸 어떻게 해석할 것인가 라는 게 제 첫 번째 질문입니다. 두 번째 질문은요. 통일 비용을 계산하는 것입니다. 이것도 제가요 아주 간단하게 예를 들어 설명을 하겠습니다. 예. 비용 측면에서 제가 하나만 예를 들어보겠습니다. 우리가 통일 비용을 계산하게 되면요. 그 비용 중에 단일 아이템으로 가장 많은 비용이 드는 게 뭐냐면 통일이 되었을 때 북한 주민들에게 우리 수준의 복지나 교육 서비스를 제공하는 비용입니다. 이게 제가 몇 년 전에 어떤 가상의 어떤 비용을 해봤는데요. 첫 번째, 북한 경제 개발은 뭐냐면 과거 한국이 30년 동안 경험했던 고성장을 북한에도 유지하기 위해서 얼마나 돈이 드는가라는 걸 왼쪽에다가 추정을 해봤고요. 두 번째로는 뭐냐면 지금 당장 통일이 되었을 때 북한 주민들에게 우리나라 한국의 2008년 수준의 복지와 교육 수준을 제공했을 때 돈이 얼마나 들겠는가 라고 추정을 해봤습니다. 보시면 알겠지만 복지나 교육에 들어가는 비용들이 굉장히 큽니다. 그런데 문제는 과연 이런 가상적인 비용이 실질적인 통일 비용이냐? 그것은 아닙니다. 왜냐하면 실질적으로 우리가 통일이 되었을 때 북한의 복지나 교육에 들어가는 비용은요, 우리가 알 수 없는 굉장히 많은 요소에 의해서 좌우가 됩니다. 예를 들어, 만약에 통일이 지금 당장 됐다라고 하면 이런 비용이 많이 들겠지만, 상당히 시간을 두고 북한 경제가 충분히 발전한 상황에서 남북 간의 갭이 줄어든 상황에서 통일됐다고 하면 이러한 복지 비용은 상당히 적거나 안 될 수도 있습니다. 또 더구나 만약에 한국 사람들이 우리나라 사람들이 통일 이전에 향후 북한에다가 어느 정도의 복지나 교육 수준을 제공하자라고 합의를 하고 이것이 북한 사람들에게 또 합의를 하게 된다면 이런 비용은 달라질 수 있습니다. 심지어는 이런 비용은 어디서도 달라질 수 있냐면 통일 당시에 한국이 누리고 있는 복지와 교육 수준에서도 달라질 수 있습니다. 이렇게 실질적인 비용은 굉장히 많은 우리가 컨트롤할 수 없는 요소입니다. 그래, 이런 상황에서 과연 우리가 이런 비용을 추정하는 것이 과연 얼마나 의미가 있는가? 제대로 추정할 수 있는가? 이런 것이 두 번째 제 질문입니다. 제 세 번째 질문은요, 우리가 통일 비용이나 편익을 얘기할 때 과연 비용만 얘기해야 될 거냐, 아니면 편익과 비용을 같이 얘기해야 될 거냐라고 하는 것입니다. 자, 우리는 일반적으로 요즘은 편익과 비용을 같이 얘기하려고 합니다. 그런데 아시겠지만 앞에서 제가 말씀드린 것처럼 비용과 편익을 계산하는 것, 그리고 그걸 확정하는 일도 굉장히 어렵습니다. 그렇기 때문에 우리는 이렇게 얘기를 할 수가 없습니다. 아니, 얘기를 하기가 굉장히 힘듭니다. 어떻게 했냐면 비용이 편익보다 더 적다, 또는 편익이 비용보다 더 크니까 통일이 우리에게 도움이 된다 또는 위험이 된다, 이런 얘기를 하기가 굉장히 힘듭니다. 그래서 현실적으로 대안으로 할 수 있는 것은 그 중에서 조금 더 우리가 잘 계산할 수 있는 비용에 초점을 맞춰서 얘기하는 것입니다. 즉 통일을 비용을 줄이는 방향으로 통일을 설계해보자, 이렇게 얘기를 하는 것입니다. 그런데 이렇게 비용만 얘기하는 방법은 그 안에다 또 문제가 있습니다. 그것은 뭐냐면 통일이라는 것 자체를 한국경제에 항상 네거티브한 요소, 네거티브 팩터로 인식하게 만들어서 사람들이 그거를 주저하게 만든다라는 것입니다. 이건 당연한 논리적인 결이죠. 그렇다면 이 두 가지 것 중에 과연 어느 것을 우리가 택해야 하는가라고 하는 것도 굉장히 우리에게는 어려운 질문일 수 있습니다. 마지막으로 이 모든 통일 비용 편익 얘기를 도대체 왜 하는가? 그리고 우리가 여기서 어떤 레슨을 끌어내는가 하고 하는 문제입니다. 자, 우리 모두 그 해답은 알고 있습니다. 아주 간단하게 좀 더 훌륭한 통일을 준비하기 위해서입니다. 그건 누구나 다 동의하실 것입니다. 그렇지만 현실을 조금만 더 들어가면요, 조금만 더 디테일로 들어가면 얘기는 좀 다릅니다. 제가 예를 하나 들어보겠습니다. 예를 들어서 아까 말씀드린 저 복지나 북한의 주민들에게 제공해줘야 하는 저 복지나 교육에 대한 비용이 굉장히 크다라고 한번 가정을 한번 하고 논의를 모든 사람들이 거기다 동의한다 라고 해보십시오. 그러면 그 다음에 우리는 어떻게 해야 될까요? 그러면 당연히 논리적으로 이런 얘기가 나옵니다. 자, 통일되면 우리가 굉장히 여러 가지 큰 비용을 지불해야 된다. 그러니까 우리 조금 준비하자. 어떻게 준비할 거니? 야, 우리 통일되기 전에 어떤 펀드 같은 거 만들어서 이런 비용을 적립하자. 또는 통일되기 전에 북한 주민들한테 과연 우리하고 똑같은 수준의 복지나 교육 비용을 제공해 줄 건지 말 건지, 우리의 반을 제공해 줄 건지, 3분의 1을 제공해 줄 이런 걸 서로 얘기해보자. 또는 야, 한국 사회가 복지를 계속 이런 식으로 늘려갔다가는 그리고 나중에 통일되면 그거 뒷감당 못한다. 한국 사회가 지금 복지 수준 문제도 우리가 아주 부익 있게 통일을 대비해서 하자. 이런 식으로 얘기가 갈 수밖에 없습니다. 그런데 이게 과연 현명한 일일까요? 물론 이런 얘기는 물론 이런 얘기는 해야 될 필요가 있을지도 모릅니다. 그런데 여기는 차이가 있습니다. 이런 얘기를 하는 것은요, 현재 우리에게 일정한 우리가 비용을 지불하는 겁니다. 그렇지만 우리 모두 동의하듯이 통일은 언제 올지 모릅니다. 이것은 미래의 어떤 불확실한 상황에 대해서 지금 비용을 지불하는 것이기 때문에 상당한 논란거리가 될 소지가 있습니다. 그래서 문제는 이런 것입니다. 이런 얘기를 과연 하는 것이 현명한 것인가? 한다면 지금 해야 하는가? 아니면 미래의 어떤 시점에 어떤 조건이 충족되면 해야 되는 건가? 그러면 그 조건이 충족되는 건 뭔가? 이런 질문. 이게 제가 가지고 있는 내용의 질문이고요. 요약하면 이렇습니다. 통일 비용과 통일 편익이라고 하는 것은 아무것도 확실한 것이 없습니다. 그래서 이러한 불확실성을 제거하려고 노력하는 것이 이 통일 비용과 편익 문제를 접근하는 가장 기본이 되어야 합니다. 그런데 때때로 이러한 불확실성을 제기하고 또 이걸 제거하려고 노력은요, 각각 개인적으로 뿐만 아니라 우리 사회에서도 엄청난 용기가 필요한 일지도 모릅니다. 이상입니다. 감사합니다. Thank you very much.
Next panelist is German Ambassador, Honorable Mr. Rolf Maffay.
As a panelist and later as a speaker, and I'm very happy to participate in this conference so well organized by Chairman Sakong-il and with the participation of former Finance Minister Carstens. At this point, I should limit myself to a few observations. The first is cost and benefit. First of all, costs of unification very much depend on the scenario that we will be faced with, that you will be faced with. And we have seen the two basic scenarios which Professor Nolan presented. Well, most probably, the first one, the abrupt one, will be the more expensive, and perhaps also the more dangerous one. But discussion is very much focusing on this abrupt one. So I think just as much thought and study should go into the possibility of having a gradual process towards integration. Secondly, people are looking at the German unification as something that happened in an abrupt manner. This is correct, but it's only half of the story. Since if you look at the foreign policy aspect of it, then it was the result of 20 years of Ostpolitik, new policy towards Eastern Europe, which started in 1969 by Chancellor Brandt. So first, we had the treaties with Warsaw, with Moscow. We had the basic treaty between the two German states. And then roughly 20 years later, things happened which led to unification. So whilst it is abrupt as the immediate process, in a broader sense, it is a process that lasted at least 20 years before the policy bore fruit. Thirdly, if we are looking at German costs of unification, and if we're looking at the figures, we tend to quote this figure of roughly 1,600 billion euro, which unification costs are in Germany until the present day. And then we try to find out how much would it be in Korea. But there is one very important point, and that is, out of these 1,600 billion euro, only 300 billion euro were for direct investment, for money going to companies, going to road construction, to infrastructure construction. But 1,000 billion euro went to social transfer. So the issue of social security, the issue of whether in case of Korean unification, the social security system that you are having in South Korea would be applied as well in North Korea, or whether you would choose a completely different solution, taking into account that social security in North Korea is at a very, very low level. This really opens a very large spectrum of solutions, and it would also result in completely different figures as far as the costs of unification are concerned. I know that one professor here in Seoul has gone into the details of how to transfer, how to manage these costs of social security in case of integration or unification. I think if you compare the two, then you have to bear that in mind, and you may want to bear in mind that you may have different solutions for Korea and much cheaper solutions and longer lasting than we choose in the case of Germany. If we look at the balance between costs and benefits, we will have to look also at the time frame. If we look for the first 10 years, it's costly. If you look at the first 50 years, then the balance may be completely different. And so I think it is important to keep in mind both the short-term perspective and the longer-term perspective. We all remember that Chancellor Kohl said in very few years we will have flourishing landscapes in eastern Germany. We know now that basically our concept is that we need 40 years. So the second Solidarity Pact runs out in 1919, which is 30 years after unification. But generally speaking, the feeling is that we may need 10 more years, not financially, but until really both parts of Germany are at the same level of wealth. So maybe 30, 40 or 50 years. In any case, the balance have to be seen in a short-term perspective and in a longer-term perspective. I tend to agree that in a short-term perspective, except for the social security, which I already mentioned, the question of possibilities for immediate investment in North Korea would be essential in order to calculate the cost. The question whether South Korean chaebols and all South Korean companies would be willing to cooperate and to go into North Korea at fairly short notice and with taking a higher risk than they would perhaps otherwise do would be crucial. The question of wages in North Korea, of investment situation in general would be crucial. If we look into benefits, it was quite interesting for me to see the question of whether the peace dividend may be important or may not be important. Of course, everything can be calculated theoretically, but I would assume that a unified Korea would be unified with the consent of its neighbors, and would be a unified Korea which would form part of a very friendly, close East Asian partnership, Northeast Asian partnership. So the perspective towards China, towards Russia, would be slightly different from a united Korea than it may be now. If we take the case of Germany, we had, prior to unification, 670,000 soldiers. We now have 250,000 soldiers. In terms of budget, originally in the Federal Republic, the old Federal Republic, the defense budget was 20% of the overall budget. Now it is 10% of the overall budget. So we shouldn't forget the internal and the external one. A unified Korea as a key player, perhaps as the center of Northeast Asia in terms of economic cooperation, of political cooperation. You are already having the trilateral secretariat here. That's a different scenario. This is not really the scenario where you want to build up a new demilitarized zone towards China, I assume, but rather the contrary. So there may be actually a peace dividend in that. Finally, migration. Yes, one may be skeptical looking at the figures for South Korea and for North Korea. But if I look at these figures, they suggest to me that at least in case of unification, South Korea or the United Korea would gain roughly 20 years' time in order to come to grips with their difficult demographic problem. So migration could be an important positive factor. And it could also be an important factor in terms of solving the overall demographic problem of Korea, at least in the medium term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You are really behind the schedule. Both presenters.
Yes, I don't want to be the man standing between a room full of people and lunch. So let me speak very briefly. I want to agree with the first or the second point that Ambassador Raphael made, which was that German unification was abrupt after 20 years of Ostpolitik. In the case of North Korea, we want to encourage institutional transformation of North Korea. So when we engage with North Korea, different modalities of engagement will have differing effects on that. If you can think about it as a kind of hierarchy from a North Korean perspective, the best form of unification. Well, when I flew here last night, my airplane, instead of flying directly across the Korean Peninsula and landing in Incheon, it flew all around China and then came down. So the best form of integration is overflight rights. The airplane flies above at 38,000 feet. Nobody even knows it's there, and the money goes straight to the North Korean treasury. Second best form of integration, pipelines and railroads. The railroad runs down the track. Nobody, talks to anybody on the railroad, and the money goes straight to the government. Third best form of integration from a North Korean perspective, enclaves like Kaesong Industrial Complex and Mount Kumgang. You can politically screen the workers who are going to have contact with people there, and you can build a big fence around it. The worst kind of engagement from the standpoint of North Korea, open engagement with businessmen looking for opportunities all around Korea, much like what the Chinese have today. And the fundamental problem that we will face moving forward is the North Koreans are not stupid. They understand precisely that we are going to push on the ways that have the greatest transformative effect, and they will try to resist. That's the basic problem that we face, whether it be 20 years or some other time period.
Thank you for your, two commentators. I would like to extend my sincerest appreciation for your informative and real stimulating comments and specific questions that you raised. I'm going to make a reply privately in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you, both presenters and panelists. I guess I'm sorry for not being able to open the discussion to the floor. I will have to end the session here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to moderate this panel. It will feature presentations this afternoon by Professor Ulrich Blum of the University of Halasala. And yes, you are here. Okay. Professor Ko Young-sun, the chief economist of KDI. They will be followed by two commentators, Professor Zhang Yong-soo of Hanyang University and Professor Holger Wolf of Georgetown University. Now, despite my physique, I am a runner. And one nice thing about being a runner is you always have a stopwatch. And so, as being the traffic cop today, I realize there's a bit of a problem here, which is that I'm here, the speaker's over there, he's looking that direction, so I really need somebody sitting right there to hold up a yellow card and then hold up a red card. But anyway, please, 15 minutes for the presenters and 8 to 10 minutes for the discussants. So, Professor Bloom, please start.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation. Let's get started. My task is to talk about the unification costs and the financing, and as the title suggests, it's an international endeavor. It cannot be done nationally by Korea. Before getting into that, let me just correct 2 or 3 fairy tales and fallacies about German unification. Preparation of German unification was done annually until 1970, because there was a report done every year on the inner German affairs that was stopped with the new government of Willy Brandt in 1970. Can be discussed whether this made sense or not. It was sort of a politeness against the East. On the other hand, we know that this politeness, especially Basket 3 of the Helsinki Accord, was a huge weapon for unification. But one should be fair about that. Second thing is, privatization did not prevent investment. It was that the claims of old owners were not honored and they went to court. Most of the property of East Germany has given to other investments, not to old owners. The highest share of old owners was given back by Modrow, the communist government in charge at the beginning of unification, the so-called Modrow privatization. All the rest was sold, but it was challenged at the court for about 6 years. So this generated the incertitude of whether you got the property. And the third thing, there is a huge benefit in unification, especially in the non-monetary parts. Part of our present competitiveness is due to the huge effort we had to undertake in modernizing our labor market, because we also had the internal competition between East Germans or Eastern Germans and Western Germans after unification. So there is a huge benefit in the location quality of Germany that has to be addressed. That's the 3 points I want to say in advance, and let's go into the paper. Yesterday I passed by the road here just around the corner, and I think these are the highest costs of non-unification, and we have to address these high costs of non-unification. That's just a poster line you can see at the road around the corner, because next year we commemorate the 60 years of the ceasefire. And I think it's important to know that non-unification is extremely expensive too. If we go into the importance of the questions, I think one must make certain scenarios about unification and try to find out what type of preparation will make sense. It is clear that unification came to a surprise, but it came mostly to the surprise of the West German government. There were lots of people who thought that it was imminent, especially those who were interested in Eastern Europe. I desperately tried to convince my government that something was needed to be done, and it was not because of my own cleverness, but it was because of my Polish colleagues who told me that there was something going on in East Germany. And finally, because I never got an answer when sending people out, I wrote a letter on 4th of July of 1989, what about German unification, if it came, what type of preparation one had, and so on. Never got an answer. Then I went to Montreal and came back after unification had happened. It was on 9th of December, and my secretary presented me a letter dating from the 8th of November saying that unification will take a long time to happen, from the inner German ministry will take a long time to happen, and then that's why research was not done, and it was what you call sort of a side story of German research, and it might be interesting to do it one day. 8th of November 1989. One day later, the guy from the office would not have sent out the letter. And he excused himself for having been ill. That's why the letter couldn't be sent out. It's very funny. Those who want to have it, I can send it to you. It's a wonderful thing. We did not want to be prepared. That's part of the story. We did not want to be prepared. Scenarios are important. Stability is important. I think this was stressed by the ambassador before, and I think it's very, very important. Unification costs will always occur. The only question is who's going to bear them? Who will take the burden? And the interesting thing about taking the burden is being prepared. Because, for instance, also part of the European community took part of the burden because of macroeconomic effects of unification. If such a unification happens, it's not an isolated effect for Germany. It is not an isolated effect for Korea, just the same. Let's go to the data, the sheer data. Unification costs in Korea, that was mentioned before, will be very expensive because the level of economic performance between East and West Germany was entirely different than that between the two Koreas. It's 20-1 against about 5-1. Difference in population count too. It's 2-1 against about 4-1 in Germany. And this is the data that I have collected for a paper that I have, it's being published now in Germany about Korean unification. And the interesting thing, just find out how East Germany calculated its own level of productivity. That was the so-called direction coefficient. It was calculated by the commercial coordinating people, and they calculated how many East German marks they needed to earn one West German mark on the world market. And it was the value of 2 in 1970, and it rose to 4.6 in 1989, which implies that the productivity for international traded goods, not tradable, traded goods, was about 22%. Now, if you believe that these traded products were the highest productivity products East Germany had, you can see that the productivity was well below 20%. That doesn't mean the well-being of people or the living standards, because this, of course, implies the cost structure, which is different. And as East Germany did not reinvest its depreciation into its housing stocks, this was, of course, possible to sort of have cheap housing, even if these houses sometimes fell apart. Economic development. This is the data for Korea as you publish it. Let's look at the data for Germany, which is very interesting because it shows two things. First, it shows the development of Germany, then the catastrophe of the Second World War, and then the rise of West Germany. This is the rise of East Germany. The economy stalls in 1972 because of the expropriations of the rest of the industrial middle class by Erich Honecker, who can be seen as the real, not the father of unification, but let's say one of the who pushed it to unification, because there was no German who has ever ruined an economy to such an extent than Erich Honecker. The private enterprises that were expropriated had a productivity, according to East German statistics, that were about 50% higher than average. And that was reduced to average. And so they didn't have money, they didn't have foreign cash, they got into a crisis. West Germany, the so-called Strauss-Loan financed part of it. They had a huge balance of payment crisis in 82. In 88, it happened again. And then you can read the famous Schürer report, who says we have three possibilities to save East Germany. Schürer was an East German minister in the planning ministry. He said we have three possibilities. Either we quadruple exports. With what? We reduce standard of living by 30%. That will create revolt. Or we change the economic system. This was ultimately done. You can read that in the files. It's in the internet. So let's go to the cost factors Korea can change. Liberalization of the education system. I will come to that because everybody says that Korea has sort of a one-shot system. And if migration comes in from the north, you must offer multiple chances. That is very important to integrate them. And I'm completely in line with Michael Funke that it's a chance, it's an opportunity to have migrants. Innovation inventory has to be made. We had in East Germany what I call pre-unification or pre-transition clusters that were industry very successful in terms of human capital. This is the growth centers of today. The areas where things don't function are industrial areas produced by East Germany that fell apart after unification. It's basically the old industrial heritage that comes in from the 19th century to the 20th century that is functioning today in the old locations. So there's a very, very stable structure. And going back again to our old picture here, what you see is that this structure means that the old East German growth path is continued presently. East Germany is just continuing the growth path it had in the 50s and 60s under early communism. Then you had the decline or the stagnation, the stalling of the economy under Honecker. Then a boost with unification, but it now is back to the old communist growth path. So it has a structural problem that has not been solved yet. It's a 70% economy of the West, and it is stubbornly a 70% economy of the West. Let's go to, wait a second. Fiscal stability and unification fund is important, but it's even more important, as I will show, to get fiscal discipline into the new provinces, because, as I will show in some figures later, differences between East German Länder are terribly strong in terms of economic performance. Let's go first to the biggest reserve to recover unification costs, that is the labor force. We had about 4.5 million East Germans going to the west and about 2.7 going into the other direction. So the East German loss is net 1.8 million people, above average young, above average skilled, above average female. They went mostly to the south, stabilized demography, stabilized the social security system, increasing production. 1/4 of West German growth over the last 20 years is produced by East German skilled workers. This generates, if you look into the next figure, a compensation for the net transfers we have to do. This is the figure of net transfers that we calculated to East Germany. So it's around 60 to 70 billion euros a year. And that is the contribution of gross national product of Easterners, the net balance of Easterners working in West Germany. And if you take half of this value, of this line, as taxes and contributions to social security, you see here that we already recover half of this simply from taxes from Easterners in the West. And then you have to account, as East Germany has a balanced account deficit, you have to include the multiplier effects of West Germany for exports to East Germany. We about break even, we have about broken even 2 years ago. So as a business case, East Germany is closed. You know, so it's starting to get profitable. You know, so this is very, of course, nice. Financing East Germany is important, or financing unification is important, but you have to look into the macroeconomic factors that are important. As I mentioned, for instance, you have an impact on exchange rates, you have an impact on interest rates simply because they go up, because you make deficit spending, the central bank compensates, the interest rate goes up, the currency goes up, and Germany went about 20 to 30% too expensive into the euro. And then had internally to devalue. These were the social security reforms, the Hartz IV reforms, the Agenda 2010, that made us so competitive that we are now able to finance the rest of the European community. But it was done with a huge effort, and it was not easily done. Just give you a number. In 1995, the export rate of Germany West Germany was about 30%, has increased to about 48%, and the 30% was a one-time low for a very long time, simply because of the high value of the D-mark as a result of the of unification. And I give you here a little picture of what the interest rate, the discount rate of the Bundesbank was. You see that it went up, and of course that offered wonderful interest rates to foreign investors, but of course we needed that money to finance the current accounts deficit. I give you some other nice data. This shows you how important it is to get into touch with industrial inheritance of the region. If you look into the regions, the yellow one are East German, the black one are West German, and this is the most performing West German region in terms of innovation potential. It's innovation expenditures in industry per inhabitant. So if you go to Baden-Württemberg, they spend something a little bit more than 1,000 euro a year. If you go to the lowest performing areas, such as Sachsen-Anhalt, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and down here, Brandenburg, that is in East Germany, it's about 5 to 7%. This is a complete destruction of innovation structure through unification, but also it was much less developed. If you take the best performing East German region, which is Saxony, you see that it is even above certain West German areas, simply because they were able to keep their industrial heritage and keep their research structure intact through transformation. That is why Saxony and Thuringia are today technologically among the most performing East German states, and they will be able perhaps in the long run to become independent from transfers. For the others, it's not that credible. That is per capita debt. Again, the black ones are the West Germans, the yellow ones are the Eastern Germans. And it's interesting to note that Saxony, again, the best performing Eastern state, is down here with something like 2,000 euros per head. And if you go to Berlin, it's about 8 times as much. And if you go here to Sachsen-Anhalt, it's about 5 times as much. So if Sachsen-Anhalt now had the best innovation structure and the highest wage level and the best industry, it could have been worthwhile to indebt yourself. But not having this quality, but being low wage region, less technologically performing and so on, of course shows that you have a choice. And having a choice means that if you have budget control, you can be very successful in the unification process. I think this is a very important lesson to learn. Hard budget constraints are important in the unification process. Don't be too generous with money. Let's go to one of the deficiencies of East Germany, which is headquarter structures. Treuhand privatization meant the destruction of the East German combine, which was correct, but also the delivery structures. So from the about 320 combines, 180 of which were national combines, machinery, electronics, and so on, were dissolved into about 15,000 limited companies that were sold in the market. The problem was that they are all subcritically small. And being subcritically small means that they don't have a sound company headquarter. From the 500 largest German firms, only 20 have their headquarters in Eastern Germany. And according to population and output, that should be something between 70 and 100. And if you know that the headquarter produces about 30% of value added and pays a lot of taxes, you know what the problem really is. You have an income problem, a public income and a private income problem. And in addition, of course, you just generate the redistribution because the taxing is done mostly at headquarters. Of course, part of the money is given back to the production areas, and so you have the redistribution that is the net transfers that we know from unification. Here I have 2 measures that relate to headquarters, and you see that beside the Saarland, which has no headquarter at all anymore, most of the East German regions are in the lower part, either according to the number of headquarters or their value against the economic size of their region. So it's normalized. So it's important, if you privatize, to keep headquarter structures. If you take the 70% economy of West Germany, of East Germany against West Germany, about 10% are due to the headquarter problem. Then we have another 20% lag, and this lag will mostly not be overcome because we have a settlement and agglomeration structure problem. If you take the agglomeration and population density structure of East Germany and look for cousins in West Germany that are alike, and you take their income level, they are only 85%, 83 to 85% of West Germany. So you take out Hamburg, Düsseldorf, Stuttgart, Munich, Frankfurt out of the West German total, and then you calculate the income level. So East Germany has perhaps 15% points to grow, not much more. And one big problem is, as we discussed yesterday with Michael Funke, is that Berlin is the ultimate underperformer of Germany. If you take other cities of that size, they have twice the per capita income of Berlin. And this is, of course, the problem. If you have a national capital that is underperforming economically, then it has no rayon and it doesn't really support the rest. If you calculate, and this is in a paper that is being published now, if you calculate based on the German experience, on sound multiplier analysis of the structure, on capital coefficients that make sense and make a certain convergence scenario, the amount of money needed to stabilize North Korea, and you assume that a demilitarized border will not stop migration. So you have to offer North Koreans something around 50 to 60% of per capita income. And as you know that if unification comes, you need South Koreans that have to go north to stabilize public administration. And they will never go north if you maintain the fence. So you must open the border. If you stabilize it that way, you have a huge stabilization gap. In Germany, it was 20% to 60%, 20% per capita income before unification. 60% is the welfare level. That's the stabilization level. In North Korea, you have 5% of the per capita income level. And if you go to 60%, you have to add 55%, and you have much more population. So you end up with a gross transfer share. In West Germany, in Germany it was 10%. It would be 27% of national income in Korea. And if you subtract the initial multiplier effect, that means the amount of money coming back and generated by tax revenues through value-added processes, you end up in Germany with 6% because the economy was working after some months rather started to work. In Korea, it would be 24%. That is 1/4 of value added that you must transfer. Last point. This is not feasible. I think it's clear to everybody. And again, these 6%, as our ambassador said, according to a study we undertook, the data comes from this study we made, only about 5 to 10%, depending on how you define it, were growth-oriented. 90% were political costs, political stabilization, administration stabilization, and social stabilization. That was the highest part of the largest part of these transfers. But as I said, if you don't want to pay them, you have to keep the borderline intact. And I don't see that this is a unification scenario that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Please be very responsible.
Okay, I'm Young Sung Ko from KDI. I'm here to present my views on the costs of unification, how we can finance them. Because I have only about 15 minutes, I will make myself as brief as possible and focus on the issues that I think are important. As you know, in case of Germany, the total cost of unification amounted to about 4 to 5% of GDP annually, and most of the spending was for the social welfare systems. And in case of Korea, there have been suggested various estimates, including the most recent one by Joe Lee, who is my friend in Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and he estimates that the annual cost will range from 10% of GDP initially and decline gradually over the years to 30% by the year 2050. And you already had so this table often during the today's seminar, and what I want to stress is the size of the North Korean economy. It is only about 3%, or to be exact, it's about 0.25% of the southern GDP. And you cannot expect much tax revenue from the North once we unified. So the tax revenue from the North, or the social contribution from the northern area, the northern part of the peninsula, will be negligible. And the most of the financing would come from the southern part of the peninsula. The question, these cost estimates assume that somehow the Korean government would be able to mobilize resources for these spending needs, but ultimately the cost will depend on the availability of the resources. On the left-hand side, you see the total amount of spending in Germany and Korea. In Germany, it is about 50% of GDP, while it is only about 30% in Korea. And 10% of GDP means different things to Germany and Korea. In case of Korea, 10% of GDP means 1/3 of total current level of spending. And it would be almost impossible to mobilize additional 10% of GDP for the purpose of unification reconstruction. So substantial part of our financing should come from reallocation of our current level of spending, reallocation across different categories of spending, and also different areas, regional areas among the south and northern part of the peninsula. First, let me give you a brief overview of the sectoral needs for public spending. Of course, there will be a large demand for public infrastructure investment. In case of Korea, it took several decades to build up the current level of infrastructure stock. And as you know, the infrastructure stock in North Korea is very poor, and it would take another several decades to build up the infrastructure investment in the North Korea. The same for the housing stocks and also for the medical facilities. Turning to the social spending, the largest spending item I would expect is the social welfare, health spending. In the South, the total amount of health expenditure is about 5% of GDP. I mean, total public health expenditure is about 5%, and most of this spending is channeled through national health insurance. And as you know, the North Korean population is about half of the South Korean population. And if we expand the current national health insurance to the north without any modification, it will mean additional 2 to 3% of GDP of healthcare spending. And it will burden South Korean public finance to a very large extent. As for other social insurance programs, there are less concerns for these programs. Because in Korea, these programs like public pensions and workers' compensation or unemployment insurance have been introduced very recently compared to other countries. In case of old age pension, for example, it was initially introduced in 1988, and right now only about 60% of our workers are currently contributing to the system. That means that 40% of our workers do not contribute to the system, and they are not covered by the old age pension. For these reasons, it is almost the same for unemployment insurance. And for this reason, these social insurance programs would not pose a great burden on public finance. Because of the limited role of the social insurance programs, the Korean government is currently relying extensively on public assistance programs, which are tax-based and do not require a prior contribution by the participants. Currently, the total amount of public assistance program amount to 18.3 trillion won, which corresponds to about 1.4% of GDP. The most important item in this table is the basic livelihood security program, which provides basic livelihood subsidies to low-income families. And they do not, in principle, it does not require a work participation by the program beneficiaries. And it currently costs about 0.8% of GDP. And as you know, the income gap between South and North Korea is very large. Per capita income in North Korea is currently about 5% of GDP, 5% of the South Korean per capita income. And when this program is extended to the northern part without any modification, virtually all the northern population would be covered by this program. So most of the North Korean population would be eligible as beneficiaries for this program. And currently, the number of beneficiaries of this basic livelihood security program is about 1.5 million. And once it is extended to the north, the number of beneficiaries can increase to 10 million or 20 million. And this will imply the increase in total spending by perhaps 10 times. So if you just look back to the number here, you can see the public spending for these public assistance programs can increase to around 10% of GDP. So it is a huge increase in our spending only for these public assistance programs. Another important issue is the transfer between central government and local governments. Currently, a large part of central government revenue is being transferred to local governments in the form of mandatory local tax sharing and also in the form of various categorical grants. As you can see on this graph, the local governments currently spend about 40% of total government spending, while it collects only about 20% of total tax revenue. So they depend heavily on the central government for their financing. And if this system is automatically extended to the north, the central government would be burdened with this local tax transfer to a significant degree. And if the current system is not altered prior to the unification, it will mean an additional burden on the central government, maybe amounting to 2.2 to 3% of GDP. Let me turn to the issue of financing methods for these spending needs. First of all, the government would be forced into reallocating resources across different spending categories and also between different regional areas. In terms of the spending categories, the government will be forced into reallocating a lot of spending on economic affairs, which amounts to about 6% of GDP in Korea, to other areas of spending like welfare and healthcare. The second source for financing should be the private sector. The Korean government, the South Korean government has relied extensively on the private resources for various public services. In case of hospitals, for example, Korea depends heavily on the private sector for the building up and maintenance of medical facilities. Currently, about 90% of our hospitals, clinics are owned by private sector, and the share of the public sector is very small. And similarly, after unification, the government would
be forced into depending on the private resources in these areas as well. The most talked of resource is, of course, taxes. In case of Korea, personal income tax is relatively low in their size compared to OECD countries. It is only about the revenue from personal income tax is only about half of the level in the OECD countries. And probably we can utilize the personal income tax to a higher degree after the unification. The general consumption tax is also a relatively less utilized source for the central government because the VAT rate is only about 10% in Korea, while it is on average close to 20% in European countries. I will skip this part. And as for the debt financing, of course, a bulk of the spending would be financed by issuing debts. The credit rating of the Korean government has risen to a higher level recently. It is now above China and Japan, in fact. So in the future, the Korean government would be able to tap into the overseas bond market for the unification cost as well. To summarize, the Korean government will face enormous needs for public spending after unification, and it will be necessary to reallocate budget across different spending categories and also across between different regional areas. The government can expect to increase tax revenue, possibly with a broader income tax base and a higher VAT rate. The government can also mobilize private sector resources and run, of course, larger deficits. But the most important would be the prioritization of spending needs. We cannot simply add on the additional spending for unification on top of the current spending for the South Korea, and drastic reallocation would be required in the future. For example, some sectors like SMEs or some areas like poor areas in the South would observe the flow of transfer from the central government dry up after the unification and diverted to the northern part of the country. I should also mention that we should pay not only on the budget constraint but on the macroeconomic constraints. The extensive investment and the increased spending on social welfare can widen the current account deficit and can destabilize the macroeconomy. It was the case in Germany after unification. The Bundesbank raised the interest rate after the unification to stabilize the inflation, and it led to, as you know, the ERM crisis, exchange rate mechanism crisis in European countries. And the central bank, the Korean central bank would pay attention to these macroeconomic issues after the unification. The most important thing right now for the Korean government is to, as I emphasized, to reform the welfare system, especially the public assistance program, which tend to decrease the labor market participation motivation for the poor. And once after the unification, the most important issue would be to induce investment, businesses investment in the northern part, and also to promote the labor market participation by the North Korean workers. But the current system, our current welfare system, especially the basic livelihood security system, has deficiency in its ability to promote labor market participation and its ability to assist the poor toward the labor market participation. And I believe that the drastic reform of our public assistance programs should be enacted before the unification. And of course, another issue currently is rationalizing the fiscal transfer between central government and local governments. And the fiscal equalization program of the Korean government should be rationalized to promote self-sufficiency of the local governments, and also to promote autonomy and the fiscal responsibility of local governments in Korea. And these two issues, I believe, should be two of the most important issues for the Korean government right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ko. Professor Zhang.
Okay, I'm supposed to make comments on Dr. Go and Dr. Bloom's papers, actually a PowerPoint, and in a general observation, I have agreed to almost all of arguments of the two economists, arguments. So I would first, give some general observations. And I would make some comments on the general aspects of the cost of unification issues, including a German case. I would propose, the three conditions for peaceful Korean unification. Without fulfilling these, there would not be any arguments or discussions on the cost of unification, because the cost of unification issues are connected with how the the unification process would be. And the third, I would make some comments on the reflections on the German unification case, and then I would conclude to make some suggestions on financing Korean unification. My general observations on the paper's arguments are two presenters acknowledge the relative burden, financial burden of Korean unification would be heavier than the German case, which I would agree. And they would cite the differences in population and economic size, and which implies the per capita burden of South Koreans would be much heavier. And in fact, the western part of Germany has transferred 4 to 5% of its GDP to the eastern part a year. So if the per capita burden of South Koreans are much heavier than the German case, then it would imply that more than 4 or 5% of GDP of South Korea should transfer to the northern part of the Korea, which is quite burdensome and maybe beyond the reach of the soundness of the Korean government, the unification government. So the most important thing would be how to prioritize the spending demands after the Korean unification. And Dr. Go also suggested a very important thing, which is to mobilize the private sector through PPP, public-private partnership arrangements, and also by the market mechanism. I would fully agree with his suggestions, and I would make some more comments on these issues in the conclusion section. And I would propose in the three conditions. This is very sensible, and I would think that almost everybody would agree with this. The first condition is the North Korean people first need to prefer unification with the South to the status quo. That's the first thing. The second thing, there should exist, this is typo, there should exist North Korean authorities that can represent the North Korean people's desire for unification. The third thing is no influential country should interfere in the unification process. So I would think that the German case in 1990 was followed exactly this unification process. And the German case, these three conditions are fulfilled fully. The German people want unification first, and then there was a democratic referendum and to represent the wishes and the wants of the German people, and then the four powers, didn't interfere in the unification process of the Germany. So, these three conditions are very important because, the nature and cost of the Korean unification would be affected fully by how this process are going in. And let me give some reflections on the German unification case and in line with the fulfilling these three conditions. These Germans wanted unification and then shouted the purchasing power of the West German mark. To fulfill the wishes, the so-called, the monetary conversion of the East German mark 1-to-1 to West German mark, and which was extremely favorable to the East German people. And most scholars, called this was the mistake, and this was the start of the failure, the so-called the failure of the German unification process. But I wouldn't agree with that, because East Germans wanted the unification. To fulfill the wishes of these Germans would be the first condition of the fiscal unification. So if the Korean unification process starts, then similar arrangements of transferring significant wealth to the north would be required to get minds of the North Korean people, which was the first and the most important condition for the peaceful unification. And this should be done only with the fiscal resources, increasing in taxes or increase in fiscal debts of the southern part of the Korea. But there will be some much more differences between the Korean unification and German unification case, because the initial conditions are very different between two cases. Especially the restitution issues for the Korean unification would be less severe, because in North Korea everything is nationalized already. But in German case, almost 50 to 70% of the lands and housing and everything was already privatized before the unification to Germany. So these two things would give some meaningful implications to finance the cost of the Korean unification. And we have accumulated lessons and implications from the German unification cases, so we would be able to make some much more better techniques that can be applied to the Korean unification case. And we have modern finance mechanisms such as PPP, which was not very prevalent in 20 years ago. And so I would make some suggestions for the financing Korean unification and a concluding remark. We have to first differentiate the nature of the financing Korean unification methods, and a major portion of the cost would be income transfers to the north, which should be financed by the fiscal resources. But the rehabilitation of the North Korean economy could be shared by the international private sector. And international financial institutions could be a partner in very early stages of the Korean unification. And as I emphasized in the beginning, I would the Koreans could utilize more of the private sector, such as the technique of PPP, public-private partnership. But I would say that the most important thing for the preparation and financing the cost of Korean unification would be the strength and fiscal soundness of the Korean government, as emphasized by Dr. Go. And personally, I would say that the Korea should become a very strong economy, such as the West Germany in 1990. That was our goal, to make a proper preparation for the future unification of two Koreas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here, and I would very much like to thank the organizers for inviting me. We have seen two excellent presentations by Dr. Blum and Dr. Ko that are very informative, very detailed, indeed too detailed that a discussion can really do much detailed comments upon. So I'd like to cover a couple of issues that have come up both here and also slightly in the morning as well. And these cover four different aspects. One is the initial conditions. Secondly, cumulative costs and how to evaluate them. Third, the financing. And then finally, some very specific lessons from the German case. We'll start first with the initial conditions. We've seen a number of estimates. Right? Indeed, if you look at the papers that have been presented at the conference, you see different estimates for the initial productivity of East Germany relative to West Germany. Likewise, there are probably ranges of estimates for the Koreas as well. And I think that is very important to keep in mind. These are not observable figures. The relative initial productivity is based on assumptions about exchange rates, prices, and others that are based on the best judgment of whoever makes these estimates, and one can disagree to some extent. So I think from a policymaker perspective, it is prudent to use a range of estimates rather than a simple one. And for Germany, 1/3 to 1/2 seems to be the range of estimates that is out there. Secondly, and sometimes more importantly, it's not necessarily the right number for looking at the cost of unification. And for the cost of unification, it is more important to ask what happens the day after. If you take the resources of East Germany, but you operate them under market conditions, what initial productivity level is generated here? That will be higher because both workers and firms have different incentives. Workers get paid in real money, they are incentivized to work. Firms get paid in real money, they are incentivized to produce. The case study for this is 1948 June in West Germany. Right, when the United States introduced the Deutschmark and Ludwig Erhard at the same time freed prices and wages, we see an overnight jump in the German output level with the same resources. And it's really that ex-post number that is relevant. Unfortunately, for the case of transition economies, there's an offsetting effect, which is that even though the incentives improve, at the same time, the capital stock in the transition economy tends to decline for a number of reasons. Right? Part of the capital is simply environmentally not sound, some of it is outdated, relative prices adjust, so the capital stock declines, which reduces output, incentives improve, which increases output, the net result could be washed, but it's really that after effect that is relevant rather than the relative productivity level before. And just very briefly, let me mention 3 other areas that I think are also very important in looking at the initial conditions. One is area. Right? East Germany is a highly densely populated area, particularly southeastern Germany, and highly urbanized. That makes it much cheaper. The fixed costs are cheap. There are only relatively few large cities and large agglomerations that have to be updated rather than a much more dispersed population. And the starting quality of the infrastructure also matters. So it was not great in East Germany, but it was there on the basics. The roads were there, the trains were there, so it had to be updated rather than reconstructed. If I may make a sort of a 15-second side tour again to the history of preparedness. One person who looked very much into the costs and benefits of unification, how to prepare for that, was actually Ludwig Erhard, the father of the German economic miracle, economics minister in the 50s and then chancellor in the 1960s, who wrote about it, including very perceptive comments about the need for a generous conversion rate when monetary unification started, already in the 1950s and 1960s. So there was some preparedness, but it unfortunately went away as time passed. Now let me briefly talk about the public and private costs. How costly is it? I think to make that argument initially has to make a very simple definition, namely at what point do we declare economic unification to be successful? Right? What's the terminal condition? We want to know the cumulative cost, we have to have an endpoint. And that has to be defined. Right? In Germany, it tends to be defined in terms of relative productivity levels. The German constitution is actually quite precise on it. Right? It calls for comparable living conditions, which is not the same as the same productivity levels. Right? It could be done via transfers. But in any case, this terminal condition needs to be predefined in order to make any final assessment of the total cost. And generally in Germany, we think about 80-90% of productivity conversions would probably be useful to call it a success, ex post. Secondly, one needs to be clear to distinguish between transition costs and reunification costs. Germany is quite unique in that sense that pure transition, in the sense of institutional transfer from plan to market, was actually done by 92-93. Right? Partly because the skilled administrators went from the old states to the new states and implemented it on the ground. Right? So the pure institutional change was actually extraordinarily rapid and done by the early 1990s. Right? Since then, we have ongoing structural economic change and growth and all sort of other challenges, but the pure transition prospect itself was done relatively early. And since then, the challenge is really one of unification, that is to say, closing that productivity balance. Right? So there are two different costs, and in some sense, the unification costs that are much higher than the transition costs themselves. And finally, coming back to a point that was raised this morning, one cannot make a simple point estimates of transition costs because it very much depends on the strategy taken. The core issue that has been mentioned several times before is migration. Unification implied joining two countries, one with a high capital labor ratio and one with a low capital labor ratio, in an integrated economy. That cannot stand. So somehow there has to be an equilibrium, but that equilibrium can happen by people moving from the labor-intensive part, East Germany, to the capital-intensive part, West Germany, or it could happen by trying to increase the capital stock in East Germany to the West German level. Those are very different costs that has been mentioned before. And the choice made in Germany to primarily emphasize keeping the skilled workers in East Germany in order to sustain long-term growth in East Germany affected these costs quite substantially. Okay. Public costs too. It's important to distinguish between the gross costs and the net costs. And I'm still remaining here within the fiscal domain. So we're not talking about societal net benefit analysis, but within the public domain. One, they're offsetting savings in government expenditures. These have been very poor in Germany. There has not been an attempt really to rethink spending in West Germany, particularly on the subsidy side. This is largely a fact of the surprise unification. Right? There was simply a lack of capacity overall to consider everything in 1998, 1999, 1991. There's too much on the plate of government to really reconsider other parts of the expenditure. But this is certainly something that could have been done. And the fact that subsidies have remained very high throughout this period rather than being rethought, subsidies to West German firms, right, is remarkable. And secondly, revenue gains. Right? We already talked about revenue gains in the new states, offsetting part of the transfers. Those are growing over time and have become quite important. But there are also revenue gains in the old states to the extent that unification actually changes the economic trajectory of the West German economy. Right? And that, being the larger economy, actually has potentially much larger impact on the revenue side. And I come to that in a moment. And largely benchmarking. Right? What should one look at to evaluate these costs? Right? We've heard frequent references here today to total cumulative cost relative to 1 year's GDP. And that's informative in some sense. Right? But these costs, of course, are borne over time, and the other metric we've seen repeatedly is percentage spending per year. Yet another way of benchmarking it, and this has come up this morning in the discussion, is a pre-savings perspective. Right? To the extent that the country pre-saves via sovereign wealth funds, as Korea is partly doing, that provides another metric. And it raises the interesting question, what is the optimal pre-savings for the cost of unification if one has a nice estimate? Right? How much should the current generation save and contribute, given that it may or may not be around when the unification happened? We don't know when it happens. Right? So how should that be intergenerationally attributed? A small caveat on this issue is that one should not stress what pre-savings can do. But in the end, after unification, real consumption has to go up in the transition economy, and real investment has to go up. That's a real resource transfer. Financial pre-savings can only help with that to the extent that it finances imports. Right? But otherwise, we still have the real resource transfer that has to be done. So it's very helpful, but it cannot solve all the issues. Okay, let me now briefly turn to the private sector output effects. First of all, there's a demand effect. Right? That has been mentioned already. Much of the money that was sent from West Germany to East Germany went straight back to West Germany because the East Germans bought West German consumption goods rather than East German consumption goods. So it acted as a major Keynesian stimulus for the West German economy and thereby increased the tax revenues in West Germany. Right? And I would assume the same to hold in the Korean case. Right, since the domestic production of consumer goods in the north is also not pronounced. Secondly, the financing has negative effects. Right, this comes in two effects. One is the tax load goes up in order to finance the unification costs, and secondly, interest rates will rise to combat inflationary consequences and the excess demand generated by the Keynesian stimulus. So that's the negative part. Third, we have the international part, and I'll talk to that later this afternoon, that unification will involve a real appreciation which harms the traded goods sector in this case in West Germany. It has a negative effect. And finally, and this is less clear and sort of less tangible, one can think about the political economy effect of unification. And it's useful to keep in mind that when the German unification happened, Germany was viewed as a brake van of the European economy. Right, a sluggish, overly regulated, stagnant economy with huge structural reform problems. Today, that's no longer the case. Right? Indeed, there's an increased interest in the social market economy as a role model even. And that transition partly reflected a number of very important reforms that happened in the interim, and primarily on the labor market. And we see two of these reforms. One was bottom-up. that happened in the mid-1990s and happened explicitly in the new states, where industrial relations moved from a sectoral and state level, very aggregated top-down level, to firm level basis, with much more emphasis on firm level happenings, productivity orientation of wage increases, etc. And the second one was the Hartz reforms early this century. Both of them cumulatively changed the dynamics quite dramatically. We can ask the question, to what extent has unification influenced the fact that these reforms took place? Right? They certainly put unemployment, which was very persistent in the new states, on the forefront, and certainly the bottom-up reforms was very much done in the new states and then spilled over to the old states. Right? And that has a permanent longer-term effect. Not something one can take to the bank and borrow against, but something to keep in mind. Right? Every country has their persistent structural problems that may or may not be easy to deal with. Now, financing. The issues here that have not been mentioned so far in detail is the allocation of these costs across generations. Who should pay for unification costs? Pre-unification in Korea actually makes, the pre-financing of unification in Korea actually adds another dimension to this. Right? In Germany it was clear it was the current generation and the future generation. Right? In Korea it's the pre-unification generation, the unification generation, and generations afterwards that potentially can finance the unification. So it's interesting again to ask what generation should pay what share for this process. Right? In terms of pure allocation, the golden rule of course implies the investment part, right, the 300 billion in Germany, the relatively small part, has permanent benefits and therefore should be financed by debt. The transfers primarily benefit the current generation rather than future generation, tends to be more towards the tax financing. Finally, some short comments on the German case. Of course, there was no pre-savings since it was unanticipated, and so the financing had to be decided on the spot. Secondly, fairly limited reduction in other expenditures, which reduced the ability to offset the cost of unification. Thirdly, as has been mentioned several times before, the cost allocation differs really between two parts. One is the necessary investment. Second is the transfers, which to a large extent were, however, implied by the German constitution. Right? One should not forget the German constitution. The German Constitutional Court has been very specific about what can and cannot be done on the social welfare side as well. And finally, there were gifts. Okay? The conversion rate, for example, the initial conversion rate that has come up several times was a gift. But it was a gift that applied to stocks. Right? It was a gift that implied that the East Germans got for their savings, the Ostmark savings, 1 Deutschmark per Ostmark, which was a very generous conversion. So for that it mattered. Right? For the flow, as I will argue this afternoon, it did not actually matter. For the wages, it did not matter. But for the stocks, it mattered, and it was a gift. And so one can think about how generous a country wants to be. This was just an explicit gift made by West to East Germany. Finally, on debt financing, it's worth to note that when unification happened in Germany, Germany had a very substantial buffer, fiscal space, as we would call it today. The unification was largely financed by debt, and it increased the debt to GDP ratio, reduced that buffer. It did not actually create significant fiscal problems in the end. Right? The long-term borrowing rate of the government in Germany did not go down 20 years after unification relative to before. Indeed, it's currently at an all-time minimum. However, if you look at it from the perspective of 2012 rather than 2008, right, I think one additional lesson is that one always wants a fiscal space for one more big crisis to happen. Right? Unification plus European financial crisis actually does push Germany to a point where future fiscal space is somewhat more limited. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it appears that due to the highly responsible behavior of the panelists, we actually have extra time. Someone mentioned that the crowd was smaller now than it was in the morning, but those of you who have persevered will have the opportunity to ask questions. So please, if anyone, yes. This is a new event, so we're not actually, yeah, here it comes, all right. Why don't we take a few questions and then we'll sort of answer them collectively, because we don't have that much extra time.
First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Junhyun Kim, Vice Chairman of Korea Associates Business Consultancy here. Thank you for your excellent presentations. All those questions of unification, cost, benefits, etc., are very important. However, I have a more fundamental question. Suppose, by dream, the countries will unify tomorrow. The most important immediate task is put some food into the mouth of starving people. And this involves enormous amount of logistics, takes human resources, administrations, etc., which is non-existent, and I cannot think of exactly how it's going to happen. Just calculating how much it's going to cost to give the food into their mouth is one thing. To actually execute it is going to take Army, Navy, or all three military forces. Who is going to do it? How do you feel about that, the side of the problem?
Thank you. Don Kirk.
Thank you. I have sort of a follow-up to that question. Two words that have not been uttered here all day are human rights. What if there is this mythical reunification? What are you going to do about the several 100,000 people caught up in the North Korean prison system, the Gulag system? There's no analogy to that in Eastern Germany unless you go back to the Nazi era. And I just wonder why that's been ignored today, and what is your response to how you would deal with that issue?
Okay, let's take one more question and then we'll answer. Any more questions? Going. Gone. Okay, so who would like to take these two questions?
Let's go to I think the justice question is extremely important. And we know from people who have come over from North Korea, last time we were here on the conference with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, how desperate the situation is. And we may have a huge amount of persons that are traumatized and will have real problems to work in the older generation. But let's be very frank, there is quite a small fraction of East Germans that was traumatized too. And if you meet these people, it's not an easy task to discuss with them what has happened to them. East Germany was a brutal state. Let's be frank about that. Second thing, we talked about the security forces. Germany had reduced its security forces after unification by 1 million people. About 600,000 came from the east. That was, of course, part of the army, part of the secret service, the Stasi and so on, but also part of the West. And, of course, with the reduction of the army even further, we have now 1.5 million people less in security force than we had before. This is about the data. The problem will be in Korea that if you tell the army, that the North Korean army, that is very much ideologized, that it will be dissolved, it will be against unification. In East Germany, it was critical. Part of the elder generation in the army wanted not to be disarmed and wanted to fight. And it didn't happen, and why it didn't happen is another story. But it was sort of a critical situation. One must be very frank. Disarming an effective and functioning army is one of the most difficult tasks ever to be done. And in most cases, it doesn't work.
Any more questions? Well, if not, I will close by making the following observation. I was surprised when I was listening to Professor Bloom's presentation, his discussion of the
Richtungskoeffizient.
Coefficient.
Direction coefficient.
How many West German marks? How many East German marks did it take to get a West German mark? In 1983 or 1984, I'm not sure which year, but I remember where I was living at the time. I was in graduate school, and like all graduate students, I had no money, and so I was always on the lookout, along with my friends, for cheap but drinkable beer. And suddenly, one day, at the local liquor store, appeared this East German beer. And it was really very high quality. But it was priced as though it was, the local bilge water. So me and my friends, we started buying all the East German beer we could find. They would bring it to the liquor store, we'd just buy all of it. So one of the reasons they were not getting so much for their output may not have just been about the quality or the productivity of the workers. It may have had something to do with difficulty of communist marketeers in understanding the American beer market and what the appropriate price point was for their product. Anyway, with that, we will close this session. I believe that there is a break outside, and then we will resume in approximately 15 minutes.